The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Estates as I pulled the Red Cross mobile blood donation unit through the pristine gates of what was arguably the most exclusive gated community in our county. The massive white van, emblazoned, with the iconic Red Cross symbol and cheerful messaging about saving lives, looked almost out of place among the manicured lawns and Mediterranean-style mansions that lined the perfectly maintained streets. I had been regional director for the American Red Cross for nearly 8 years, and in all that time I had never encountered a situation quite like this. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the elderly matriarch of the Whitman banking family and longtime Red Cross supporter, had personally requested that we bring our mobile unit to her neighborhood. At 83, she could no longer make the trip to our donation centers, but her passion for helping others hadn't dimmed one bit. She had convinced 12 of her neighbors to participate in what she called a neighborhood blood drive, promising to make a substantial donation to our organization if we could accommodate her request. The logistics had been challenging. Willow Creek Estates wasn't just any gated community. It was the kind of place where former governors lived next to tech moguls and oil executives. The Homeowners Association was notoriously strict, with rules governing everything from mailbox colors to the height of garden gnomes. Getting permission to bring our 40-foot mobile unit into the community had required weeks of paperwork, insurance documentation, and formal presentations to the HOA board. I thought we had covered all our bases. The HOA had issued a temporary permit allowing us access from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. on this particular Tuesday. Mrs. Whitman had distributed flyers to all participating households, and our team had coordinated with the community's management office to ensure smooth operations. What I hadn't anticipated was the new security guard who had apparently started work just 2 days earlier. As I navigated the narrow streets toward Mrs. Whitman's address on Magnolia Lane, I couldn't help but admire the community's attention to detail. Every house seemed to have been designed by a different architect, yet they all somehow harmonized perfectly. Spanish tiles gleamed in the morning light, while perfectly pruned palm trees swayed gently in the coastal breeze. It was the kind of place where a mobile blood donation unit definitely stood out. I had just turned onto Magnolia Lane when I saw him in my side mirror, a uniformed figure on what appeared to be a golf cart, following about 50 yards behind. The security guard looked young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of overeager posture that suggested he took his job very seriously. I didn't think much of it at first. Security guards often followed unfamiliar vehicles through upscale neighborhoods, and I assumed he was simply doing his due diligence. Mrs. Whitman's house was impossible to miss. A sprawling 2-story colonial with white columns and a circular driveway that could accommodate several vehicles. I had visited her home twice before for Red Cross fundraising events, and she had always been the perfect hostess. True to form, she was already standing on her front steps, wearing a powder blue dress and waving enthusiastically as I approached. I pulled into her driveway and began the careful process of positioning the mobile unit. The vehicle was equipped with hydraulic stabilizers and required precise placement to ensure a level surface for our donation chairs and equipment. As I worked the controls, I noticed the security guard had stopped his golf cart at the end of the driveway and was speaking into what appeared to be a radio or cell phone. "Margaret!" Mrs. Whitman called out, using my first name as she always did, despite our professional relationship. "Right on time! I've got coffee brewing and fresh. Pastries from that wonderful bakery downtown. The first donors should start arriving around 10. I smiled and waved back, then focused on completing the setup process. Our mobile units were marvels of engineering, fully equipped medical facilities that could safely collect blood donations, while meeting all FDA requirements. The unit I was driving that day was one of our newer models, featuring air conditioning, comfortable reclining chairs, and even a small recovery area where donors could rest and enjoy refreshments. As I activated the hydraulic stabilizers, I heard a sharp, authoritative voice behind me. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned to see the security guard approaching, his hand resting on what appeared to be a utility belt, equipped with various tools and devices. He was indeed young, probably fresh out of college, with short-cropped hair and the kind of intense expression that suggested he viewed his job as a calling rather than employment. "Good morning," I replied pleasantly, extending my hand. "I'm Margaret Chen, Regional Director for the American Red Cross. We're here for a scheduled blood drive that was approved by your HOA board." The guard didn't shake my hand. Instead, he pulled out a small notebook and began flipping through pages with dramatic flair. "I don't see any blood drive on today's schedule," he announced, his voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood. "And this vehicle is way too large for residential streets. You're creating a safety hazard." I felt my first twinge of irritation, but maintained my professional composure. "I understand your concern, but we have all the proper permits. If you'd like to call your supervisor or the HOA office, they can confirm our authorization." "I am the supervisor," he replied with unmistakable pride. "Chuck Morrison, head of security for Willow Creek Estates, and I'm telling you, this vehicle needs to leave immediately." Mrs. Whitman had apparently overheard the conversation because she came bustling down her front walk, moving with surprising speed for someone her age. "Chuck, dear, there must be some misunderstanding," she said in the patient tone one might use with an overexcited child. "This blood drive has been planned for weeks. I spoke with Mr. Henderson from the management office just yesterday to confirm everything was in order." Chuck Morrison's chest puffed out noticeably. "Mrs. Whitman, with all due respect, unauthorized commercial vehicles are strictly prohibited. In Willow Creek Estates, the CC&Rs are very clear on this matter." "But it's not a commercial vehicle," I interjected, beginning to feel genuine frustration. "We're a non-profit organization providing a medical service. We have liability insurance, proper licensing, and written permission from your HOA board." Chuck pulled out his cell phone and began taking pictures of the mobile unit from various angles, as if he were documenting evidence of a major crime. "The size alone violates our community standards," he declared. "Plus, you're blocking the entire street. What if an emergency vehicle needed to get through?" I looked around at the wide street, which could easily accommodate 2 fire trucks, side by side, even with our unit parked in the driveway. "The street isn't blocked, and we're completely within the driveway boundaries." "Look, lady," Chuck said, his tone becoming increasingly aggressive, "I don't care what kind of organization you claim to represent. Rules are rules, and I'm paid to enforce them. You have exactly 5 minutes to move this thing before I call the real police." Mrs. Whitman's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Young man, do you have any idea what the American Red Cross does? They save lives. They help people in disasters. I don't care if they're the Peace Corps," Chuck interrupted. "Unauthorized vehicles don't belong in Willow Creek Estates, period." At this point, I decided to try a different approach. I walked back to the mobile unit and retrieved my folder containing all our documentation, permits, insurance certificates, correspondence with the HOA board, and letters of appreciation from various community leaders. "Chuck," I said, using his first name in an attempt to establish rapport, "I completely understand that you're trying to do your job. But look at these documents. Everything has been properly approved and coordinated." He barely glanced at the paperwork. "Anyone can fake documents these days. How do I know this isn't some kind of scam?" I stared at him in disbelief. "A scam involving a 40-foot medical vehicle with Red Cross logos?" "Identity theft is a serious problem," he replied solemnly. "People will try anything to gain access to upscale communities like this one." By now, several neighbors had emerged from their houses to see what the commotion was about. I recognized a few faces from previous Red Cross events, successful, professionals who had always been supportive of our mission. They seemed as confused as I was about the security guard's behavior. "Chuck," Mrs. Whitman said, her voice taking on a steely edge that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being contradicted, "I want you to call Mr. Henderson right now and verify our arrangements." "I don't have to call anyone," Chuck replied. "I have full authority to remove unauthorized vehicles from the premises, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." He reached for his radio and began speaking in what he probably thought were official-sounding codes. "Base, this is Unit 1. I have a Code 7 situation on Magnolia Lane, requesting backup for vehicle removal." I couldn't help but notice that his radio seemed to be a simple walkie-talkie, and whoever was on the other end sounded like they were speaking from inside a building, rather than any kind of professional dispatch center. "Chuck," I said, making one final attempt at reason, Why don't we all just take a step back here? Mrs. Whitman has organized this blood drive to help people in need. We have donors scheduled to ARE. What happened next would haunt me for months afterward. Not because of its cruelty, but because of its profound irony, the kind of cosmic joke that makes you question everything you think you know about human nature and the invisible threads that connect our lives. As I stood there staring at our deflated mobile unit, my phone began buzzing insistently. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Hospital, emergency, and my stomach immediately knotted. Emergency calls on blood drive days usually meant one thing: a critical shortage that required immediate response. Margaret Chen, I answered, stepping away from the crowd. Margaret, thank God, came the urgent voice of Dr. Sarah Chen. No. Relation. Despite the shared surname, the chief of emergency medicine at St. Mary's. We have a massive multi-vehicle accident on Highway 101. 7 casualties, all critical. We're completely out of O-negative blood and 2 of the victims won't make it through the next hour without transfusions. I felt the world tilt slightly. O-negative is the universal donor type, always in short supply and exactly what we had come to collect today. Mrs. Whitman and 3 of her neighbors were O-negative donors, something I had specifically noted when planning this drive. Sarah, I'm having a situation here, I began, but she cut me off. Margaret, I don't care if the building is on fire. We need that blood now. How quickly can you get your mobile unit to the hospital? I looked at our immobilized vehicle, then at Chuck Morrison, who was now writing what appeared to be an incident report with the meticulous care of someone documenting a federal crime. It's going to be at least 2 hours, I said quietly. Maybe 3. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Margaret, Dr. Chen said finally, her voice hollow. We don't have 2 hours. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Chuck Morrison had inadvertently signed death warrants for people he had never met. The weight of this knowledge felt crushing, but I also knew that telling him wouldn't change anything. In his mind, he had done his job correctly. What I didn't know was that Chuck Morrison had his own phone call coming. Robert Martinez had indeed called someone, specifically his old law school roommate who happened to be the mayor of our city. Within 15 minutes, 2 actual police officers arrived at Willow Creek Estates, followed closely by a representative from the city attorney's office. They listened to my explanation, examined our permits, and immediately informed Chuck that he had committed criminal mischief and destruction of property. Chuck's confident demeanor began to crack for the first time. But I have authority over community security, he protested to Officer Rodriguez, the senior patrolman. You have authority to observe and report, Officer Rodriguez replied patiently. You don't have authority to destroy property, even if that property doesn't belong in the community. As the police took Chuck's statement, I called our regional office to arrange for emergency tire service and a backup mobile unit. But even working at maximum speed, we were looking at a minimum 3-hour delay before we could resume operations. That's when Mrs. Whitman approached me with tears streaming down her face. Margaret, dear, this is all my fault. If I hadn't insisted on having the blood drive here, none of this would have happened. I was about to reassure her when I noticed Chuck Morrison had gone very still. He was staring at Mrs. Whitman with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion, mixed with what might have been recognition. Mrs. Whitman? He said quietly. Eleanor Whitman? She turned toward him, her eyes still red from crying. Yes? Chuck's face had gone completely white. His hands, which had been steady while deflating our tires, were now trembling visibly. Mrs. Whitman, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You probably don't remember me, but my name is Charles Morrison. Chuck Morrison. Eleanor studied his face carefully, then gasped and pressed her hand to her chest. Charlie? Little Charlie Morrison? The transformation that came over Chuck in that moment was extraordinary. The rigid, officious security guard seemed to collapse inward, replaced by what looked like a frightened child. Yes, ma'am, Charlie Morrison. Mrs. Whitman took an unsteady step toward him. Oh my God, Charlie! What are you doing here? How long has it been? 12 years, Chuck replied, his voice breaking. 12 years since the accident. I watched this exchange with growing bewilderment, as did the police officers and neighbors. Whatever was happening between these two people clearly had a history that none of us understood. Mrs. Whitman turned to address the crowd that had gathered. Everyone, I think Charlie and I need to talk privately for a moment. Would that be all right? The police officers looked to me and I nodded. Whatever this was about, it seemed more important than our immediate crisis. Mrs. Whitman led Chuck, Charlie to a pair of wrought iron chairs on her front porch. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I could see Chuck's shoulders shaking, as Mrs. Whitman spoke to him in the gentle tone one might use with a wounded animal. After about 10 minutes, they both stood up, and Mrs. Whitman walked Chuck back to where we were all waiting. "Margaret," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional weight of whatever had just transpired, "I think Charlie has something he needs to tell you." Chuck Morrison looked around at the assembled crowd, police officers, neighbors, the Red Cross director whose equipment he had just destroyed, and took a deep breath. 12 years ago, he began, his voice stronger now but still shaky. I was 17 years old and I was in a car accident, a really bad one. My girlfriend and I were coming back from prom and a drunk driver hit us head on. He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Whitman. Sarah, my girlfriend, she died at the scene. I was airlifted to St. Mary's Hospital with massive internal bleeding. The doctor said I needed immediate surgery and multiple blood transfusions, but the hospital was running low on my blood type. I felt my chest tighten as I began to understand where this story was going. Mrs. Whitman was at the hospital that night, Chuck continued. Her grandson had been in a different accident earlier that day, and she was already there when the Red Cross put out an emergency call for blood donors. She was one of 5 people who responded immediately. Mrs. Whitman was crying again, but silently this time. The doctors told my parents later that without those emergency donations, I would have died within the hour. Mrs. Whitman's blood, her actual blood, is the reason I'm standing here today. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear cars passing on the distant highway, birds chirping in the manicured trees, the soft hum of air conditioning units. But among the people gathered in this driveway, no one moved or spoke. Chuck looked at our deflated mobile unit, then back at Mrs. Whitman. I never got to thank you, he said simply. After I recovered, I tried to find you, but the Red Cross couldn't give me donor information because of privacy rules. I've spent 12 years wondering who saved my life, and today He gestured helplessly at the disabled vehicle. Today I may have prevented you from saving someone else's life. Mrs. Whitman walked over to Chuck and took his hands in hers. Charlie, she said, do you know why I organized this blood drive? He shook his head. Because every year on the anniversary of the night I donated blood for you, I try to organize a donation event. Not because I want recognition, but because I never forgot how it felt to help save a young man's life. You've been in my prayers for 12 years. At this point, even Officer Rodriguez was wiping his eyes. Chuck turned to me, his face streaming, with tears. Ma'am, Margaret, I am so sorry. I don't know how to fix this, but I'll do whatever it takes. I looked at this young man who had, in the span of an hour, gone from being my antagonist to being a living symbol of everything the Red Cross stood for. The irony was almost too much to process. Chuck, I said gently, the best way to fix this is to help us save the next person who needs what you needed 12 years ago. What followed was remarkable. Chuck immediately called every towing and tire service in the county, offering to pay personally for emergency service. He contacted the HOA management office and got explicit permission for us to remain on the premises as long as necessary. He even drove his golf cart through the neighborhood, going door to door to apologize to residents and explain the situation. Within 2 hours, our mobile unit was operational again. Mrs. Whitman's original donors had waited, joined now by a dozen additional neighbors who had been moved by Chuck's story. Even Chuck himself rolled up his sleeve to donate, though he was so nervous he nearly fainted during the process. But the most meaningful moment came when my phone rang again. It was Dr. Sarah Chen from St. Mary's Hospital. Margaret, I wanted to let you know that both O-negative patients pulled through. We managed to get emergency blood from 2 other hospitals, but it was close. As I hung up, I realized that Chuck Morrison, the same person whose blood had been saved by Red Cross donors 12 years earlier, had nearly prevented us from saving 2 other lives that same day. Chuck had been standing nearby and overheard my conversation. "Did they make it?" he asked quietly. "They made it," I confirmed. He nodded and walked away to continue setting up chairs for donors, but I could see him stop every few minutes to wipe his eyes. By the end of the day, we had collected 23 units of blood, more than double our original goal. Chuck Morrison had